Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Midnight Launch minicast. I'm joined by Robert
Hello.
and Jack.
Hi. Mostly ladies. Hi.
Yeah. What's up, ladies? And I am Michael. And today we're going to talk about AAA games, specifically how story and gameplay relate and where we think this is going to go. So when I think about a big game, and I think about, very much so blending story and gameplay, Mass Effect comes to mind right out of the gate because of how much the game will change depending on how you interact with your conversations. That's very much so something that's very well done in the game because all the conversations are done in the cinematic engine, or in the game engine, sorry. That was fucking stupid. So that's really important because, for me personally, to keep me interested in the game and keep me wanting to play the game, if you do something that's cinematic, if you stay in the game engine and not go to cinematic engine, that's awesome. Now, if you want to bookend something with a cinematic, that's fine. But if you're going in, if you suddenly shoot me out to just have a conversation, and then you shoot me back into the game, taking a little side trips to the cinematic engine, I see that as really not ideal.
And the Final Fantasy games are kind of notorious for that, aren't they? Or just a lot of JRPGs in general?
Yeah, they're really... Well, I mean, there was one game, Lost Odyssey for the Xbox 360, did that really well.
Mm-hmm.
It had really seamless integration between cinematics and, just regular gameplay.
I would say Kingdom Hearts... Did Kingdom Hearts do that really well?
I'm not sure, I never played that.
That seems odd. I mean, from what I can tell, from what I remember playing, I didn't play that much. It seems to do that really well where, other than the beginning and ending cinematics, everything was, this is rendered in engine in the game.
Mm-hmm. Assassin's Creed actually does that really well.
Uh-huh.
I mean, only like introductions and stuff like that, and trailers and whatnot are really CGI'd up. But when it comes to gameplay and like talking to the person you just assassinated, everything is rendered in game, which is cool.
Which is another thing we can talk about there is those little kind of surreal post-death things are a really cool way of sticking a little bit of story into gameplay. Because you're talking to the person that you literally have been hunting for the last hour.
Mm-hmm.
Learn all these cool things about them, then you get to have a conversation with them in the last...
It's also a good way of reminding you that, oh, by the way, you aren't really in this world, you're just a memory of this world. Because it had white walls, stuff like that, being in the Animus. Which arguably is a bad thing in a way of sense, because it sort of breaks immersion, but,
It breaks sort of... It's sort of like, an Inception kind of thing, where it's a layer within a layer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a problem I think a lot of
the Animus.
Yeah, a problem I think a lot of the Assassin's Creed fans have to deal with is, if you've played through the last one, the future Desmond, or the present Desmond rather, is the story gets really disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
In the earlier games, you get this disconnect between Desmond and Altair. So Altair would, you do all this cool stuff and way back when, and in Jerusalem and stuff, and then you go back into present, and you kind of get to do complete story stuff. You kind of delve into the story, you read the writing on the walls, it gets you psyched up for the next game. But and there's that kind of disconnect there, which a lot of people have issues with. But a game I think that did storytelling really well in gameplay while still maintaining gameplay aspects was BioShock. Because everything was in-game, and they hold your hand for part of the storytelling things, but you still get to be the big daddy. You still get to be the man walking around with the wrench and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't break that. They kind of guide your hand, which surprisingly they do that really well in Just Cause 2. So Just Cause 2 story is really wacky, really insane. Horrible voice acting, hopefully it's on purpose, but the gameplay is just phenomenally fun.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make any sense, but it's just this is just so fun. And a lot of people felt that way about Saints Row 3, a lot of people didn't, but all the story missions, if anybody even played any of those in Just Cause 2, made you some really cool things.
I actually feel that way kind of about Gears of War, and I know Michael will disagree with me, but that's the kind of thing I feel about that game. It's fun as hell. I can just dive into that game, and I have a blast, but I just can't make myself care about the story.
Yeah,
but
I can't.
The gameplay makes up for it because it's just so much fun to play Gears of War.
As much as I want to, punch you through the internet, I can totally see why. It's not like they go for something complex of, there's this huge, thing you have to really care about. God, this fucking alarm clock. God damn it.
I think that's been in 3 videos now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I can understand why. I mean, in the end, it's just you fight to survive. But the thing is, Gears of War isn't so much about the overarching thing. It's more about the characters and how they interact with each other. In the end, I mean, that's all the books have been about. It's always been about how these characters fight. It's about the fight for survival. The overarching thing really, doesn't matter that much. But it's all about the character interrelation.
I could see that coming across very well in the books, but I didn't get a whole lot in.
Well, there was a lot with
the game itself.
There was a lot with that one character. What was his name? And his wife Maria.
Dom.
Yeah, Dom and Maria. That was interesting in Gears 2. Probably. But I feel like a lot of shooters just like. I'm not saying Gears of War in particular, but a lot of shooters. If you haven't read the books, and we talked about this before, like a lot of this stuff is just totally less significant, and they feel like, well, no, we have to go fight for survival down here, and they're like, oh, this is a really cool set piece, and we can do a lot of really cool things here. But I feel like the story just guides the gameplay, rather than the gameplay being an integral part of the story.
And I can totally see that. I mean, I'll never say that Gears of War has the most complex or the most engaging narrative out there. But it certainly does the job when the gameplay is truly what the strongest element of Gears of War has always been, is it's very good interaction. Like, I have this theory that all games are technically puzzle games, and I could go on about that for freaking ever. But if I could give another example of a game that really does that sort of what I like about keeping the conversations in engine is Far Cry 3. That game does a seamlessly rendered world with all the characters completely rendered in engine, and it does it so well that I think they set a really good new standard for open world storytelling mixed with very effective gameplay. That a lot of games are going to have to go to a new level.
Yeah.
In all honesty.
And I think it really helps in that point, like having everything just like seamlessly integrated into the gameplay, is that it doesn't take you out of the character. For instance, in Ocarina of Time, as you get like your first actual Ocarina, well, not in the woods, but as you're going to Hyrule Castle, you're still that character, and they like set you right back into it, as like Ganon's escaping with Zelda and stuff. And you never leave, like you're never leaving the area. You're never going into like super fancy graphics where everything looks like hyper realistic and stuff. Everything's just like, well, you're still this character. You're just going through different things, and we're going to let you experience those different things, but we're not going to boast it up for you.
And one of my big things about games is that when you think about games, typically you're either isometric, you're first person, or you're third person. And I'm going to throw isometric out of here for the moment because typically isometric games don't have as much of a presence of story. They are inherently by their nature not as immersive.
Would you mind explaining what isometric games are real quick?
Isometrics is the original Fallouts, StarCraft. Also RTSs are isometric. That's a big one. Diablo is isometric. That sort of stuff.
Just because you're not like submerged in the world, you're just kind of like a viewer. But I feel like people still get really, really immersed in their characters.
Because you're attached to your character. If you're attached to your character, that's the thing. When I'm going to specifically cite first and third person shooters. First person shooters, by their very nature, are meant to be hyper immersive. You're seeing through the character's eyes. You're seeing their arms move. You're seeing everything happen.
You are that character.
You are that character. And very few games manage to do cinematics without screwing it up in some shape or form. I would say as much as flack as I could probably get from this, the Call of Duty games have always managed to do first-person storytelling very well. You never leave your character's perspective, ever.
Except in loading screens.
Well, yeah, but then again, I'll think about Modern Warfare, the first one. It's just you're going around and then you suddenly shoot down into your character and you're inside your character's eyes.
Yeah.
But when I look at Halo, that game, it always goes into these cinematic movie shots, even though it's a first-person game. And by its very nature, you would look at it and go, well, that's not immersive, and yet I still feel attached to my universe in a weird sort of way.
What I was going to say is that there are times when having those separate little cinematics can totally work. Halo is a great example of it. Something like the Arkham games for Batman.
Oh yeah,
definitely. Really love that because you can see. It's easier to see individual characters' reactions in each thing.
In this case, I'm talking specifically first person. I'll get to third person in a moment because I have enough to say about third person as well.
Sure.
The thing about first person is that if you remove your character from if you in a cinematic or when you're in a conversation, if you remove your character from that first person perspective, by its very nature of what it is, that breaks immersion. Now, in Halo, the games in first person is very immersive, but when you move it out and you do that sort of circling around or whatever, it's usually more to develop plot and just send you along your way and really tell a story. Probably the best example of this would be, in sort of a converse way, would be in Halo 1 when you find that helmet and you learn about the Flood for the first time. That is a crazy, immersive experience.
Yeah, definitely.
But the majority of other times when it's cinematic, you pop out and you're watching the Chiefs talk to Cortana or 3-4 or a Guilty Spark, that sort of stuff. But otherwise, in a first-person game, if you remove yourself from first person during a conversation or something like that, by its very nature, I say it breaks immersion, which is why I like Far Cry 3 a lot, is because you're never leaving that third-person perspective.
There are times when that can work too, though. Like the Bad Company games, like the Battlefield Bad Company games, you get so much out of those characters, out of your squad that aren't the main character who doesn't actually do that much. But when they get into the little cinematics in between levels or during missions or something like that, you get to see more of them. You get to see them more clearly instead of just their in-game animations. You get to see their faces. You get to see the way they move during conversation, which is something that's harder to convey if you're running around in first person because you might not necessarily be looking at that character.
Mm-hmm. Understandable. So now I'll move over to third-person shooters. Third-person games, by their very nature, are not immersive. You are removed from a character. You can typically zoom around and look at all angles of your character. Now, it's great for looking at a character, but by its very nature, it is not immersive.
I'm going to argue with you on that, but we'll do that in a minute.
I say that by its very nature, it's not immersive because you are detached from a character, you aren't looking through their eyes. You can't see the universe in the same way you can as a first-person character. No, I'm not saying that's a problem with storytelling. I'm saying it's a problem with immersion. Now, granted, immersion is a very controversial is the wrong word, but immersion is a very subjective thing. Do you care about it or do you not care about it? And that can really help make or break your game. And I just pulled up a live stream, for example, and I'm looking at that over the top ridiculous trailer for Crysis 3. Have you guys seen that trailer yet?
Yeah.
Oh my god, because that sort of shits on what the game was about in the end, so being a serious game. But going to third-person shooters, it's very difficult to be holistically immersed in the game alongside presenting a story completely without really being hyperlinear. When I look at like Mass Effect, I'm very, very much so involved in that story. I'm very immersed in the universe because of how the game works. It's a very linear game. When you get down to it, it doesn't really have a lot of open areas to explore. But if you were to play Fallout or Skyrim, the modern ones I'm talking about, or modern Elder Scrolls, in third person, you'd be immersed in the universe, but let's not beat around the bush. That the storytelling in that game is kind of weak. I'm not saying it's bad story. It's just not necessarily amazing in terms of story.
Sure.
So, what is it you were going to argue about, Jack?
I was going to argue that I think you and I, well, this isn't really an argument, but I think that you and I define the word immersion very differently.
Of course.
And that goes into what you were saying. It's a really subjective term. But I think that a third-person game can be just as immersive as any other. I think that a game like the first Assassin's Creed, you feel like you're in a Jerusalem in 1191.
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, is immersion. I don't need to be seeing through Altair's eyes. Or even the Batman games. I feel like I'm in Arkham Asylum because of the work and the detail they put into that to make that setting.
I would never say a game is immersive. I would never say a game isn't immersive if the universe isn't succinct. I'm just saying, by the very nature of what a third-person game is, you are not in the same. You are just not as immersed right out of the gate. I'm not saying that the games aren't immersive. I'm saying by the very nature, the game is not as immersive as other games.
See, and that's you're putting that as an absolute. You might want to phrase that as an opinion, because
That is my opinion. I'm just saying that, in my opinion, by their very nature, third-person games are not as immersive, simply because of how they're presented.
Well, let's look at how we see this, because in first-person games, it's saying that you are the character, but in third-person games, you're seeing everything they do, you're seeing how they move, things you don't normally get to see in a first-person game. You don't get to see what they're dressed, you don't get to see how they react to everything, you don't get to see every one of their you don't get to see their leg moves, how their body moves with everything like you would in Gears of War or Zelda or anything.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in my opinion, I think I connect more to third-person games than I would in first-person games like Call of Duty and Halo. Because even though Halo does this really well with like lens flares and stuff on the helmet, I feel like third-person games do this very well because everything you can do, you can just imagine yourself doing, and you can see it and you can imitate it. It's much harder to imitate those kinds of emotions in your head than you would if you just like look and you just maybe his hands come up every now and then. Even though you're not getting this whole camera point of view that you would from the first person, I say that some games even do it better in the third person. Of course, there's such a variety of first-person and third-person games that I feel like absolutes don't really have a place.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But anyways, how do you think games are being treated, like series and stuff are being treated in the future? Because I know playing through Hitman Absolution that in Blood Money and stuff, they would kind of give you a level and they'd say, go about it. We have story to tell you here, and it's going to progress regardless. So, have fun with the level. There's all these different things you can do. And Absolution, everything was kind of segmented. So you could have this kind of experience here, but that experience would be totally, like, renewed, and you would still be going down the same path. So in a level, like, you can't complete a whole assassination level. Like a whole story segment that you would be able to in Blood Money and Absolution because of how they changed it and because of how they kind of handheld you through those different rooms where choice was still present, but it still wasn't a full choice. And a lot of things are doing that, especially also I say. I feel like Assassin's Creed is doing that as well, actually, because they're streamlining all their game mechanics, especially in 3. 3 was streamlined so hard. And, Revelation, there was a lot of quick-time events and stuff, which is cool. Revelations was a really solid game. But 3 was, like, mostly quick... Well, no, there wasn't mostly quick-time events, but there was a lot of parts where it's just like, well, I guess I have to sit back and watch the cinematic now. Whereas you don't get that approach, you don't get all those stealth options and all those really cool things that you can do in the first game to assassinate, like, a target. Everything was really streamlined, and all, like, the little jump mechanics made... like doing things and like playing around on your own a lot more difficult. So I feel like the narrative and the gameplay there are really going in two different ways. Whereas in those two series, the gameplay is being more limited, and the story's taking a more primary objective there. Where in games like Just Cause 2 and Far Cry, the story's still there and it's still important. Well, not so much in Just Cause 2, but like they lead you to do cool things. And I think that's really cool when games just, like, lead you to do cool things. Like, in BioShock, you're always doing something interesting. You're always visiting a newer place because the story led you there. but also because the story doesn't hold your hand and force you into these situations, you're still left to your own devices to decide how you're going to handle anything.
And that is one thing that's nice about games. You can make parts of the story optional, like looking at Bioshock, the audio diaries.
Oh,
They're not something you need to pick up. You can just go out of your way to find them if you really want, or you could just walk past. There's parts of the story that are brilliant, that are really fun to listen to, but you don't need them to be there. And you could just go through the game without caring, and just walk through the game, just talking to the radio messages that you can't skip. But those little audio diaries, you can just go and grab them all on your own, and it's not something that needs to be forced on you. You can choose whether or not to do it yourself.
I feel like games, looking back, I feel like games that have had, like, a larger impact and, and how much fun I've had and, like, their longevity, games that don't hold your hand, generally, they feel like they have a bigger presence in, like, your gameplay memory, so to speak. Whereas there's still games, that, like, I've really enjoyed and have had, like, emotional impacts on and stuff.
Hello?
But I feel like, I don't know, a lot of the issues... Oh, shit. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Alright. I'm just having connections issues. But, what was I saying? God damn it. A lot of the things, I always look back and I'm like, this game, it didn't hold my hand as much. You could really have a lot of fun with this. Whereas, like, other games, they hold your hand more, and they're just like, games like Dear Esther, I just hated. You couldn't do anything interesting in that game besides have your hand held and just, like, be forced along this rails of explore the story. And I feel like that's a really big issue in games. And I don't like when I'm just being forced to do stuff. I like to be able to, like, play around and stuff like that, which is why I like Hitman games, because you can kind of just, like, creatively, although you're obviously within limits, you can kind of creatively just, like, enjoy... Oh, let's call Jack back here. We lost him. You can kind of creatively just enjoy the levels. Same with Just Cause 2. But the second they put you into, like, a really, 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 like, corridor shooter, like, there's parts of Dead Space where I'm just like, this is just really obnoxious and I don't want to do this. And it's like, ugh, we have to do this again. And, it's just really, really obnoxious.
In terms of,
there we go.
In terms of, like, optional stuff for story, I could definitely cite, Mass Effect 1, at least, for doing this a lot, where there were a lot of little lore things you could find that really helped develop parts of the game, flesh out more fully. There are a lot of games that have, like, if you do this little mission.
Yeah, they have those in Dead Space 3 actually, with co-op stuff.
Then it really shows this thing or that thing, and so if a game has that, we talked about this when we talked about lore back in the first podcast. If a game does that more, then it allows the people who pay attention more and go out of their way to enjoy more about a game.
So ladies and gentlemen, meet my fucking Ethernet cord. Sorry about that.
We're just talking about how this stuff is going in the future, and how games are less memorable for me personally if you don't get to, like, have fun with them and the narrative isn't shoved down your throat. But I don't know. I feel like the way games are going, like big AAA titles, I feel like they're going to be more narrative driven and the gameplay is going to be hindered, but you're going to be more interactive with your environment. You're just not going to be able to approach, like, the larger situations as much as you'd like to do. But in terms of indie games are doing a lot in terms of narrative and gameplay. For instance, Go to the Moon was just on sale on Steam recently. And
I heard about that.
And that's strictly... There was a game on suicide, actually. I forget what it was called, but it was, like, a really, really emotional game. It was like a 2D sprite game. And it was a top-down view, and it was like one of those old SNES RPGs. And they just described depression, and everybody who played it was like, this wasn't fun, but it was really interesting. And everyone with depression was like, yeah, this is spot on. And there's games like To the Moon where it's like, you really enjoy it, and the narrative is really there, and the gameplay is not so much. And there's other games like Proteus and Minecraft where there is no story. It's just about gameplay.
I think there will always be that distinction. There will always be developers that make things focusing on one or the other, and there will always be people that try to do both. And sometimes it'll work, and sometimes it'll crash and burn.
Do you think with the newer AAA generation just around the corner, do you think it's going to be solely focused on more narrative and less gameplay, trying to emulate the movie business?
I think there are going to be some that do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there'll be some that don't. There'll be a lot that don't. There's always going to be somebody who says, "Oh, I love that part in this movie," or something. That's too general. Sorry about that. Mm-hmm. But there's always going to be someone who tries to emulate something from another medium, and sometimes it'll work. Sometimes it has worked in the past. Mm-hmm. But there will be people who will say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to try to do that. Let's try to make things all about the gameplay, or let's try to make things all about story, but in our own way.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons. No, there's a lot of really big games that are just like. That's the one problem I have with first-person shooter story games is, if you're not having fun and they're not constantly giving you like this freedom that you have, that's like, oh, I can do whatever I want now. Like as we were talking before with like the Saints Row 3 syndrome, when it's like, the story's not really important and you can do a whole lot of stuff, but we're really giving you the narrative and the campaign to let you do some of the coolest stuff you can do. Which I think is interesting because it's opening up the narrative to give more gameplay options, which is always really helpful.
Where the narrative exists to give you gameplay options.
Yeah, which I think is really cool. When I play a game like Just Cause 2, and the gameplay just gives you really cool options, whereas like in Hitman Absolution and Assassin's Creed 3, the narrative's there to really give you options and stuff, but the core gameplay without the narrative is really lacking.
In what?
Well, in Absolution, I don't know if you disconnected while we were talking about this, but in Absolution versus Blood Money was you get to a level, you can do whatever you want, so you beat the level, and then you can go to the next level. Absolution was really narrative-driven in the level areas were smaller, but they connected to other levels. And so, like, you'd go to, like, one area, so, for instance, a level is, like, you have to get into this hotel and assassinate somebody on the top floor, right? Mm-hmm. And so the first part of the level, you get this whole, like, sandbox area. But the second you, like, touch the elevator in the basement, which is where you have to go, then you're, like, on another level, and that's considered, like, another area.
So the guys in the previous area would just forget you existed?
Yeah. And so you didn't get this whole build-up event of just executing the perfect assassination.
So really they made it a little more accessible. If you fucked up in one spot, that wouldn't completely ruin your entire assassination.
Yeah, and they gave you more interactive options, and they gave you like more stuff to do, and they made the gameplay better, but they made like the whole level design and the narrative too strong.
And there's a thread about this in
same with Assassin's Creed too.
In Reddit, and they talked about making games more accessible. Mm-hmm. I want to see how this next generation goes because we have quite a few games coming out very soon. We got BioShock Infinite, Judgment, that the Tomb Raider game's coming out very soon.
Yeah, that looks good.
So it's going to be, sort of it's I always think that in the end, if a developer tries to do something new, that typically people who are fans of an older series, when they try to do something new, like they go out of their way and they say, we're going to do this brand new thing. We're going to try and change this game and make it not easier to get into, but we're trying to change it and present our own idea. Mm-hmm. And people typically crap their pants because they're changing a game from what they're used to. I think we've talked about this before. So it's definitely going to be interesting this next generation because we're going to have a lot more memory to work with in terms of being able to do stuff.
The hardware is just going to be more
robust. So, hopefully the big companies who have a lot of money to spend on making games try something different than what they're used to. And this is sort of why I'm not really crapping my pants about Destiny, is because Bungie's been making games where you're in the future shooting dudes since they started making games. Marathon, you're in the future shooting dudes. Halo, you're in the future shooting dudes. Now, I'm fine with shooting dudes in the future. I think we all are. But
I can get behind that.
But, I'd like to see a company go out of the way and do something new. You know?
Well, the second somebody does something new, for instance, with Chivalry or with War of the Roses, everyone's like, this is incredible, this is really cool, more games need to do this. And which is cool because I feel like indie games are really like the trial and error. Popular ones get stuff that's more integrated into like AAA titles. And just like, for instance, a lot of games are dealing with more personal things, more emotionally developed characters, and AAA titles are doing that. And I feel like there's a lot of interesting genres out there that AAA developers can't really rely on. There's just a lot of stuff that indie devs and smaller publishers just like have to do. And I feel like it's a trial and error ground, and the AAA publishers, although a lot of, more strategical games of the last gen like Splinter Cell and Absolution and Hitman, they really shined in the last generation.
I think a lot of time... Sorry, go ahead.
Now that the stakes are bigger, they kind of have to rely on, like, what sells the best.
I think that
which I don't agree with, but, it has to happen.
I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you, like, 3 times in a row.
It's cool.
I meant to say that, I think that what you're describing happens in a lot of different mediums. I think that the cool new ideas come out of things that aren't big yet a lot of the time, or that are even shot down for a while. Like something like, I don't really know if this is going to sound kind of grandiose, but something like punk rock everybody fucking hated it when it first came out. When it first kind of debuted, people were like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
Okay, so this is something you guys probably don't know. There's the publisher EA, which everyone has a vendetta against, and I actually have a couple things that EA does that's actually very good, surprisingly enough. They have a rule where, because they are such a big publisher, because they have such an influence, they can go to console manufacturers, Microsoft, Nintendo, Sony, and they can go, okay, we're going to have this game come out in your console, and they just send them builds, and Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo go, okay, we do it, because of their influence, they are able to get these games to come out, and they can just do it with anything. They don't have to go through some sort of major certification check. Well, it's something along those lines. It's not exactly that, but it's very much so similar to that. And then I could send you an article about it or something very soon. So they're actually able to go out of their way and try to do something new with games, which we saw that happen in the later parts of the 2000 and the first decade of the 2000s. We saw like Mirror's Edge. They picked up Mass Effect, even though Mass Effect was originally published by Microsoft, which everyone seems to forget. So it's very interesting to think about this.
Yeah, well, I definitely think the future for indie games is definitely, it's out of the role of, let's make a silly game and get it on the Xbox Live Marketplace, and now it's more like, let's make a serious game and test the waters and see what people like, and let's really put our heart and souls into this, which I'm not saying indie games haven't done in the past, but it's definitely more popular now. And I feel like, AAA titles are definitely, they're going to have a stronger narrative now because the technology's there. But I also feel like the gameplay elements are going to start getting reasserted. Because we saw a lot of titles, for this generation of consoles where, the narrative was overpowering, and There was just like overall issues with the gameplay and oversimplification. And I feel like at the end of this generation, we're really starting to see a comeback in that.
So we've been talking for a while about this stuff,
and
Jack's disconnected the second time. So you wanna have sort of like a final wrap up on
yeah,
what
sure.
you think?
So I think indie games are really going to be the testing grounds of what we can do with narrative and what we can do with gameplay. But I also feel that AAA titles are really going to be focused on what sells the best. So, if Blood Money sold really well, adjusted for inflation, but Absolution didn't, maybe, they're going to try and work that back into the gameplay. But there's a lot of game series where they really want to touch on the story. For instance, in Dead Space 3, the story was just a really interesting, they needed to do it. They needed to wrap up the story. They really needed to go somewhere with the story.
Okay.
And I feel like narrating that was important. So indie games, are like the playground, the testing ground, doing a lot of interesting stuff. You're going to see a lot of really gameplay-oriented stuff like Minecraft and Proteus and stuff, but you're also going to see a lot of really, really narrated games like To the Moon and Proteus and Dear Esther and stuff. And that AAA games are really about, in the future, really about molding new titles and series and stuff with new graphics and stuff to keep the narrative there, but also try to keep keep the fans there with older gameplay mechanics.
True.
So we'll see.
All right, so this has probably been our longest minicast yet, longer than even probably longer than some podcasts you've seen in your life. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Michael, joined by Robert, and unfortunately Jack, who's decided to disconnect again. Thank you for listening. We will be back as soon as possible with more discussion about games and the fact that they're awesome. See you guys later.
And don't forget to subscribe, and if you have any ideas for mini podcasts or gameplay you want to see, just send us a message at our YouTube or, just put it in the comments. All right, thank you. Good night.
Thank you, guys.